what if Pentecost never happened? Picture Jerusalem by dawn, lamps blinking like tired fireflies, hills in soft violet, the city not yet awake. Upstairs, a small group waits, breath held, eyes on the door. In the story we know, a sound like a rushing wind fills the room. Fire rests on heads and the world tilts. But in this world, the air stays still. The silence holds, nothing moves, and that quiet ripples into centuries. Let's ground ourselves first. The canonical story, as the book of Acts tells it, begins with a promise. After the crucifixion and the resurrection, Jesus tells his followers to wait in Jerusalem for a power from on high. It's the festival of Shavuot, Pentecost in Greek, when diaspora Jews flood the city to celebrate first fruits and the giving of the law. The city is a global crossroads, Judea and Cappadocia, Egypt and Rome, Parthia and Elam, different languages in every alley. On that morning, it happens. A sound like wind roars through an upper room. Tongues, like little flames, appear and rest on each person. And suddenly, speech breaks open. They're speaking real languages they never studied, and people outside hear their own mother tongues naming the wonders of God. Confusion turns to awe. Some think it's nonsense, maybe wine at breakfast. Peter steps forward, not the hesitant fisherman of old, but a voice made bold. He quotes the prophet Joel, "I will pour out my spirit on all flesh." He connects David's Psalms to Jesus. He reframes fear as hope, and that day, thousands are baptized. Community forms, shared meals, shared resources, shared risks. Lame walk. Prison doors open in the night. Leaders emerge, Peter, John, James. Then Stephen, whose words ignite persecution and a diaspora of a different kind. Messengers running outward. The movement leaps from Jerusalem to Samaria, to Damascus, to Antioch. It crosses language borders like a sparrow hopping branches. And when Paul, once a persecutor, encounters a blinding light on the Damascus road, the Gentile mission takes form with fierce clarity. A council in Jerusalem later decides, no, Gentiles won't need to become Jews to follow Jesus. The door swings wide. Letters are written. Congregations appear in homes from Corinth to Rome. Coastal roads that served merchants now carry good news. That's the launch pad Pentecost built. Now, what if that launch never fired? Same city, same festival, same waiting hearts. Dawn breaks, and the breeze is just a breeze. No roar, no flame, no burst of languages that makes a fisherman sound like he grew up in Phrygia. The disciples wait another hour, another day, another week. Faith still there, but the spark missing. At first, almost nothing seems to change. They still pray. They still go to the temple courts. But without that cascading language miracle, the global crowd stays just that, global, but unmoved. Pilgrims go home with stories about the feast, not a new message to carry. There's no sudden public sermon that forces a city to decide. No 3,000 in a day. The community remains small, familiar, inward-facing. Peter is still Peter, loyal, emotional, brave in short bursts. But now his courage has no kindling. James, the brother of Jesus, quietly keeps the group rooted in Jerusalem's rhythms. They share meals in private homes, whisper memories, break bread with trembling gratitude. They become a circle of remembrance more than a movement of proclamation. Open the map. See Damascus? In the canonical story, news reached Damascus quickly, enough that Paul, Saul then, organized a mission to arrest believers there. In this alternate path, there are no believers in Damascus to chase. Saul stays in Jerusalem a bit longer, attending debates in the temple courts, perhaps verbally sparring with a few Galilean men about a teacher's empty tomb. But there's no spreading fire to stamp out, no sense of emergency. And without that pursuit, the road to Damascus goes quiet. The blinding vision? Maybe it never happens. Or if it does, it's not anchored to a network that can disciple him. The figure of Paul, pastor, letter writer, traveler, becomes a possibility that never resolves. And if there is no Paul, watch the ripple. No letter to Galatia struggling with new believers from outside Judaism. No letter to Rome sketching a breathtaking arc from Adam to a new humanity. No urgent note to Corinthians juggling house-church chaos. The New Testament starts to look thinner, quieter, maybe a few collected sayings in Aramaic, a parable or two preserved by memory, a slim narrative written decades later, if at all. Without letters to copy, there's less reason to build scribe networks, fewer scrolls to carry, fewer readers to teach. Pause those letters and look at languages. That morning of many tongues had done more than wow a crowd. It set a pattern. Speak across differences. Don't wait for people to become like you before you share life with them. In our what if, that pattern never crystallizes. The group sticks to the mother tongue. Maybe someone translates here or there, quietly. But there's no dramatic, public proof that the message belongs in every language. So it doesn't move as easily into Greek streets or Latin forums. It stays in the soundscape of Aramaic and Hebrew prayer. With growth slowed, pressure from authorities changes too. In the canonical timeline, public preaching and signs provoke arrests and interrogations. Persecution, ironically, becomes the wind that carries seeds. Here, the movement is less visible. No huge sermon on Solomon's portico. No ecstatic languages bringing a crowd into a question. Some leaders shrug. One more small sect among many. Without a flashpoint like Stephen's fiery speech, maybe there's no martyr to spark scattered mission. The group stays local, protected by obscurity, but also constrained by it. Meanwhile, synagogue communities across the empire keep doing what they've always done, welcoming God-fearing Gentiles to listen, perhaps even to join, but on specific terms. Learn, convert, commit to the law. In the canonical story, the council in Jerusalem becomes a crucial hinge. Gentiles are welcomed without the full yoke of the law, no circumcision requirement for membership. That decision lets the movement sprint. In our world without Pentecost, that council may never convene at all. There's no pressing wave of Gentiles to force the question, and if the question is never asked, the door stays smaller. To enter, you become like the founders first. The vision shrinks from all flesh to familiar faces. Now stretch a thread from this small upstairs room to the city's future. The year 70 approaches. The temple falls, stones thunder, smoke climbs to the sky. Rabbinic Judaism rises from the ashes with fierce, brilliant focus. Where does the Jesus movement go? Without a wide Gentile branch, without letters stitching communities together, perhaps it dissolves into the broader currents of Jewish life. One school among many, a memory to be debated and preserved in footnotes. Or a small cluster relocates east of the Jordan, a community of peace-loving families tending gardens and telling children about a teacher who loved enemies. A teacher whose words make their hands gentle. But notice the world beyond Judea. Without a vigorous multilingual movement, the wider Roman Empire keeps its spiritual map a little longer. Mystery cults hum in underground temples. Soldiers still join Mithras under flickering torchlight. The imperial sun, Sol Invictus, arcs through coins and festivals. Philosophers debate duty and fate, pity and joy, as ever. Local gods guard local gates. There's no swelling chorus of house churches gathering in back rooms, no weekly readings from letters passed along roads. That means centuries shift. When we say Constantine, we picture a cross painted on shields, an emperor who throws open the door to a formerly persecuted faith. But if there's no widely spread church to meet him, no bishops to convene, no creeds to negotiate, there's nothing to adopt. Maybe Constantine lifts another banner. Maybe he keeps the empire's religious policies pragmatic, a blend of solar worship and civic rituals. The big councils that shape doctrine never convene, because there's no one to convene. No Nicaea, no Athanasius, no theological vocabulary that later generations used to talk about God and humanity. Think of language and culture. Christians historically have been relentless translators. Greek to Latin, Latin to Gothic, Armenian, Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, languages shaped by scripture, liturgy, and song. Without Pentecost's founding drama of your own language, do those translation waves ever crest? Maybe much later, and much thinner. Monasteries, which once preserved manuscripts and taught reading, might not form the same way. Without monasteries, the chain of copied books grows fragile. Some classical works vanish that, in our world, survived on monastery shelves. The imagination of Europe, The vaulting arches, the rose windows, the great bell towers mapping time across villages, never quite develops, or develops around different symbols. Even beyond architecture and books, think of everyday mercy. Early communities ran almshouses, cared for the sick, rescued abandoned infants in certain cities. They wrote about the poor not as a nuisance, but as a neighbor. Not uniquely, not always consistently, but notably. Remove Pentecost's engine, and you slow the spread of that network. The empire still has generosity. Synagogues still organize charity. Families still care for their own. But the particular spread of institutions, hospitals, orphan care linked to congregations, takes a different route or arrives later, shaped by other hands. Rewind to education. Many medieval universities grew from cathedral schools and monastic study. Scholastic debates that train minds to argue carefully begin in rooms where scripture and philosophy wrestle. Replace that with a patchwork of temple schools, guild apprenticeships, and civic academies. Still good, still rich. But the curriculum shifts. Fewer psalms by candlelight. More hymns to Apollo, perhaps, or commentaries on Stoic duty. And later, an entirely different synthesis when new monotheisms rise. Here's another ripple. Quieter but profound. Identity that spans borders. A global church, for all its fractures, has often said, "we," across classes, languages, and lands. Without early cross-linguistic belonging, that habit of "we" emerges differently. Empires still knit people together, yes, but as subjects of power, more than as members of the same worshipping family. The idea that an Egyptian farmer and a Briton soldier might recite the same prayer, read the same story, and call each other brother or sister, harder to imagine. And then, of course, time keeps advancing. The 7th century arrives. A new faith rises in Arabia, swift and confident. In a world without a widely spread Christianity, its early encounters across the Mediterranean look different. Some cities, no longer full of bishops and monasteries, greet new rulers with fewer theological debates and less entrenched church politics. Cultural exchange takes new forms. Libraries hold different catalogs. Translations flow along different routes. Set all these ripples next to a single quiet room where wind never roared. The absence is startling, yet history is never simple. Humans are creative. If not this spark, perhaps another. Perhaps a teacher stands in Antioch years later and speaks with unexplainable love to Greeks in a market. Perhaps an ex-soldier tells a story in Latin that opens a baker's heart. Maybe a small, slow movement still crosses lines because people are people, and kindness is magnetic. But would it reshape empires? Would it stitch a network of care and texts and shared identity that outlasts Rome and frames continents? The answer leans toward no, or toward a much slower yes. Quick pause. If this version of the story played out, which single ripple do you think would change the world most? The absence of Paul, the lack of translations, or the missing council in Jerusalem? Share your thought below, and if you're enjoying these respectful what-ifs, tap like and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey. Back to our map. Let's zoom into Antioch, that bustling hinged city where, in the canonical timeline, followers are first called Christians. In this alternate path, Antioch remains a trade hub, fragrant with spices, loud with carts. But the little house near the Tanner's district is quietly different. No meeting of Greeks and Jews over bread and wine. No elders laying hands on Barnabas and Saul to send them out. The road to Pisidian Antioch stays empty of missionaries. The Areopagus in Athens never hears a fisherman talk about an unknown god. In Corinth, a tent maker sets up shop and makes tents, nothing more. He doesn't write to advise on love that is patient, kind, not envious. That famous passage ends up unwritten, replaced in wedding ceremonies by poetry from somewhere else. Zoom out again. In our world, the idea of the image of God and the story of a cross-shaped, self-giving love seep into laws and ethics, unevenly, imperfectly, sometimes contradicted by those who claim them, yet undeniably present. They push against gladiatorial games, soften punishments, argue for the dignity of prisoners, make space for the weak. Without a wide Christian presence, similar ethics emerge elsewhere, of course. Stoics speak of shared rationality. Many cultures honor the poor. But the particular blend that later abolishes arenas, builds hospices, and preaches forgiveness as a public virtue, develops along stranger paths. Maybe it arrives via philosophers in Alexandria, or through emperors seeking mercy in a moment of plague. Maybe it arrives, but the story behind it is different. The practices attached to it flow through other institutions. And about the Bible as a book people hold. Imagine a Europe without vernacular Bibles defining languages. No Luther hammering verses into German rhythms. No King James team saturating English with cadence. French blooms under courts and poets, not under psalters. Slavic scripts still form, but not because a missionary duo invents an alphabet to translate scripture for Moravians. Literacy spreads, yes, but by trade demands and civic paperwork more than by songs and sermons. Yet, even inside this alternate, something beautiful lingers from that small upstairs room. The memory of a teacher washing feet, stories of meals shared with outcasts, a rumor, an empty tomb. Even without the wind, there are whispers that change lives in quiet villages. A mother tells a child to forgive. A craftsman refuses to cheat a buyer. A neighbor shares food during a famine. Small lights, not a blaze. What's striking is how one hinge, if removed, doesn't just close a door. It redirects many hallways. The absence of a public multilingual launch slows momentum. Without momentum, no counsel to widen the door. Without a widened door, no letters stitching wide communities. Without letters, no libraries of doctrine and hymn. Without libraries, no monasteries. Without monasteries, a different Europe. Without that Europe, different empires later, and so on, down the line. Of course, all of this is speculation, respectful, curious, and not doctrinal. For many, Pentecost is not only a historical claim, but a living reality, a personal hope. We're not touching that here. We're turning the story like a jewel to see how its facets throw light on culture. And we're noticing how fragile and how strong movements can be. Fragile, because one missing moment changes so much. Strong, because even without that moment, the human hunger for meaning, mercy, and community finds routes we can't predict. So, if Pentecost never happened, the map looks different. Fewer cathedrals, more temples lit by other fires, fewer letters in the back of a book, more scrolls of other wisdom, fewer shared prayers across continents, more local chants rising to local skies. But the longing remains, to hear something in our own language that tells us we are known, forgiven, and invited into a larger story. Maybe that is the secret of why Pentecost, in the canonical story, feels so decisive. It doesn't erase differences, it meets people inside them. It says, right where you stand, in the words you learned from your mother, there is a sentence of hope meant for you. Whether one believes the wind blew or not, the idea is powerful. Bridges instead of walls, welcome instead of gates, meaning spoken in familiar sounds. Let's end where we began, in that upstairs room, before any wind, with ordinary people waiting. The candles flicker. Footsteps pass on the street below. A marketplace rooster insists the light has come. History often turns in rooms like this. Small, patient, filled with hope. And whether through sudden wind or slow kindness, what grows from such rooms has the chance, again and again, to make the world kinder, braver, more human. That's a story worth remembering in any timeline.